Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 17th seminar in our series, Horizon 2055. And it's a real pleasure to introduce you to today's speaker, Simphiwe Zondani. Simphiwe is a 2024 Mandela Rhodes Scholar and someone whose work is very skillful. He kind of moves between poetry and storytelling and critical reflection. He grew up on the oral stories that have kind of been part of a whole Xhosa culture and imagination. And that early grounding keeps shaping the kind of rhythm, I think, and the depth of all of his writing today. I know this because I am a co-supervisor of his MA. So his poems have appeared in the Kalahari Review, and 3 of them were longlisted for the Sol Plaatje European Union Poetry Award, and that was later published in the 2023 anthology. And alongside his poetry, Simphiwe is also an academic. He already holds a master's in media studies, and he's now doing a second creative master's where he is experimenting with bringing traditional Xhosa folklore into the short film form. And so he's, in a way, breathing new life into old stories through contemporary media. So in this seminar, he will be talking about poetry as a way of thinking and speaking about our city today and in the future. And this conversation is actually set in the past. So there's a whole timeline set, or at least in conversation with the past 19th century IsiXhosa writers. Back then, poetry wasn't just a creative outlet. It was kind of like a form of journalism, a political act, a way of participating in public life. And Simphiwe's talk is going to, I hope anyway, ask what it might mean to use poetry in that way again, especially concerning our speculation maybe about what a future citizen of our city might look like. Okay, so Simphiwe, welcome. Very glad to have you with us and looking forward to exploring how poetry can kind of speak to and for our city and for citizens of the future. So thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Okay, so I'll press on, but before I do, I just wanted to kind of basically walk you guys through a bit of the madness that kind of drove me this way. It was effectively birthed from the expedition we kind of did in and around Nelson Mandela Bay, the kind of visits to Van Stadens, to the water treatment plant and all those types of things. And in thinking about the kind of creative intervention or the kind of what I had to offer in terms of kind of thinking and kind of projecting us into this kind of speculative future, I was kind of thinking about the things that I already had in my wheelhouse. And the idea there was poetry, but also through kind of the media training and my undergraduate training, there is also a deep kind of appreciation and training within journalism as well. And there I was kind of looking at kind of these things, when you kind of look at them initially feel disparate, but they actually are quite connected. So I started diving into some digitalized archives where they had a lot of collections and clippings of early 19th century newspapers, and 2 of which included, I think one of the most extensive ones as part of the UCT catalog was Isigidimi and Imvo Zabantsundu, right? And those kind of feature a lot of writing and a lot of early Xhosa kind of writing and journalism around what was happening at the time, and a lot of like counter to the colonial rule at the time and what was basically projected onto them. But there was also, interestingly, a lot of poetry as well, and they would kind of utilize poetry with the same kind of zeal that one would journalism. Poetry was kind of this very much this social commentary form, and not just purely kind of like an aesthetic literary form that we would kind of consume in a leisurely fashion. It was highly politicized, and what was interesting is a lot of them, Gqeberha, would utilize a lot of pseudonyms or nom de plumes, and those would also kind of be like voice of the people and all those types of things. So I was like, okay, this is quite interesting. So it's a nice way to kind of frame the offering that I will have for what we have in the future. And I'm still busy with the poem itself, so I'm not actually touching on the poem, but rather the theoretical framing and the process around it and the actual idea itself. But it's set against this particular historical kind of tradition. And also additionally, I think what made me think about this is that we are kind of like in an interesting place in terms of talking about Xhosa culture and orthography and literature par excellence, because we kind of, I think between this year and last year, we kind of are sitting on the cusp of the 200-year anniversary of effectively the first Bible published by John Benny and the Glasgow Missionary Society at Lovedale Press. I think that was about 1824. And that particular moment also is making me think about those particular things, and kind of also this kind of interesting tension between the oral and the written, right? And that kind of poetry also that kind of first appears there also kind of embodies that particular tension, because it draws from the oral, and you see in print, you kind of see this interesting form of poetry that's not quite as tamed into like a literary kind of man of letters European mode of poetry or that kind of tradition. Okay, I think that's a little bit of context, and that kind of will help us navigate where we are. So I'll kind of take us through the abstract before I kind of dive into the rest of the things. I think I've kind of covered a lot of this stuff, but I think an interesting point that I wanted to talk about is there's a phrase in the abstract that I utilize, which is this the kind of notion of an elemental crush. And that was in one sense a literary flourish, but also additionally, it was borrowed from Alice Walker's poem, The Nature of This Flower is to Bloom. And in that kind of sense, Walker uses that kind of thing to speak about these kind of converging forces that basically work against the self. And I kind of liked that as kind of a way to kind of atomize the very different tensions that we're seeing in terms of kind of that are affecting and afflicting the citizens of the city and the city itself, this kind of multi-pronged poly-crisis kind of that we're seeing ourselves in. Okay, so I think that kind of covers the overall introduction, but then I'll just dive into this kind of exploration. So effectively, to truly grasp kind of this idea of the fourth estate, so truly grasp kind of this idea, we first have to kind of look at the notion of the fourth estate. And effectively, when I always teach my students, I always kind of tell it very simply and kind of talk about feudalism and this idea of those first three estates, and then journalism coming in and becoming a fourth estate and a way for people to gain a voice. So it's kind of democratizing, and it's playing this kind of critical watchdog role. So that's what I mean when I speak of a fourth estate. And also it's nice to kind of link poetry immediately to that idea, because that poetry was then within those particular newspapers, right? So in that kind of sense, it becomes this kind of potent discursive vehicle, right, that utilizes forms like izibongo, and then kind of also houses them within this kind of Western vehicle, right, which is the newspaper. And that kind of mode had particular trailblazers, one of which was Wellington Gqeberha, right, who was a poet, and he was effectively Isigidimi's first editor, right, and from like 1881. And he kind of embodies this kind of fusion of the kind of this old, don't want to say old, but this older kind of more traditional notion of critique with this kind of new borrowed process. And I think one of the most quintessential examples of that is the poem Zemkinkomo Magwalandini, which was further later kind of put into print as part of a further collection. And effectively, a translation of that would be the cattle is being plundered, you bloody cowards, effectively. And it was talking about the great cattle killing, which then also kind of led to a famine and also a lot of forced conversions amongst the Xhosa during that particular time. And it was a particular kind of indictment in order to rally a kind of politicized consciousness within Xhosa people at that time, and was almost like this clarion call of resistance. And in a particular way, right, we also have Isaac Williams Wauchope, right, who was also a writer within Isigidimi, right, and he basically was writing in a similar mode, and the push there was for people to effectively, he also utilized poetry as a means to kind of call for non-violent protests. So to him, poetry was a mode where people could actually counter. So this kind of idea of fighting with the pen. In the poem, he kind of talks to people. He says, leave the breech loader alone, turn to the pen, take up the ink, and all will be well. So there's this kind of idea and this kind of idea of like the quill as a particular weapon that you can utilize in that kind of way. And to kind of utilize then this kind of newspaper form and this mass produced form in order to get that kind of poetry to more hands. Because if you're thinking about oral Xhosa poetry, right, you have an immediate audience. So the idea there is that it's quite an intimate thing, but now that it's put into print, it's massified in a sense. So there's also an opportunity for it to be experienced by a lot more people. So this is the kind of notion. And this is also where this kind of notion of Zwelakhe comes from, right? It's a kind of colloquialism that I was often thrown around in our household whenever one was being kind of very opinionated and kind of not following the rules. They would say Zwelakhe. So, and that's kind of like a more denigrative thing where it's kind of like it's effectively that you're very self-driven, you're very stubborn, but you are so attached to your own opinion, your own voice, your own perspective. So I was trying to then push it into a more productive direction and kind of speak about that notion of, similar to Wauchope, kind of talking about this idea of taking up poetry in that fourth estate kind of model as being people that abangozwelakhe, right? That kind of working as a particular counter against a particular kind of oppressive mode of governance, inefficiency, etc., or even a way to reflect on those and kind of bring about a broader kind of consciousness, right? And also within this lineage, we can't forget Esikhe Mqhayi, right, who's often seen as, well, who's kind of like lovingly called the Shakespeare of Xhosa literature. And he also is then the editor of Imvo Zabantsundu and Izwilabantu, right? And he writes a lot of biographical poems that also appear in those particular newspapers, and they effectively work in a similar mode and then set the scene for later poetry that we see, particularly. So, and also they set the scene for like later poetry that you see within the post-apartheid context, where we see poetry utilized as a mode of resistance there as well, right? And with Mqhayi, he kind of takes on this particular tradition of Wauchope and Gqeberha and basically kind of becomes this almost like national poet laureate, right? Even if you look at his works like Isigidimi and Imvo, which is effectively him kind of going further than just like taking the fourth estate, but also kind of utilizing the written mode as a means to kind of have this tangible, historical documentation, but utilizing poetry as that particular mode in order to almost immortalize that particular moment, but also comment on it and then keep it for future generations, right? And I think that serves as like a good context to then go into my particular intervention, because I have quite a lot that I kind of prepared, but I'm kind of, as I'm talking about it, I'm kind of thinking about it and I'm just like, okay, I don't want to bore you with too much biographical detail, but it's capturing the spirit of that particular tradition and lineage and utilization of poetry by those particular people who represent kind of a longer lineage in order to talk about the kind of contemporary intervention that I had in mind. So I think when we did the expedition that we did, I think I was quite struck when we kind of arrived at the Zwartkops River, and we effectively kind of got to see that estuary and kind of got to see the pollution and kind of how it works as a particular kind of ecosystem and those particular things, and thinking about that. And in a sense, I also thought about an article that I'd read recently, I think possibly a month before that, which was talking about a particular river in Zambia, which was, I think that what was striking was the headline was "A river died overnight in Zambia," and they were talking about basically a catastrophic waste spill that happened on the Kafue River, right? And then basically resulted in like a lot of cataclysm, a lot of death of animals within that ecosystem, etc., etc., etc. And I kind of used that as a particular kind of touchstone to start thinking about what could I do, and I kind of got to this idea of kind of maybe doing an elegy and kind of looking towards that, looking at what just happened and then projecting us into this kind of near future, speculative future, in order to start thinking about, okay, what would this elegy look like and how could I draw from that particular 19th century type of tradition. So the idea there, and inspired by that particular thing, is to have both a recorded version of the poem, which would be exhibited, but also to have print kind of newspaper, zine type of materials as well, to kind of have it there in print as well, to kind of represent that kind of oral print and have that kind of interesting intersection as well, in order to kind of go and kind of pay homage to this particular thing, right? And it's effectively kind of structured as a dead river, and you're kind of drawing on all of the kind of polluted banks and the particular areas that it effectively runs through. And I wanted it to be, and I kind of want it to be, let me not say past tense, but when I was initially conceptualizing it, I was thinking of it as kind of being a little bit more multimodal in order to draw from that particular one. And the idea then of the elegies is idea of remembrance and kind of also drawing from and do that particular kind of thing, in order to also draw from like a tradition of kind of poetry that kind of draws from like source of bodies of water and things of that, of poetry effectively, right? From kind of like experiences, observations, and there's also kind of this kind of little bit ethnographic thing going on, and it allows me to pull together different threads that I was thinking about at the time into a particular kind of cogent mode. And in terms of theoretically, when I think about it, it kind of sits in this particular post-colonial third space of poetics that Baba speaks about quite a lot, and kind of speaks to this kind of idea of kind of defying binary logics of like traditional literature and those types of things, but kind of sitting in this particular space where it basically draws from the inherent performativity of poetry in and of itself, but also kind of utilizes the strength of print as well in terms of kind of this kind of tactile tangibility and, you know what I mean, infallibility as compared to the oral as well. So kind of playing around with those two as well. Right. And there's also a sense of kind of drawing on Kaya a little bit, as well as Waltope, and kind of playing around with that idea of poet as journalist, poet as biographer as well, in a sense, in order to kind of see this kind of historicization of this particular thing. I'm still kind of playing around with the linguistic sensibilities of it, because I think one of the things that was very striking about the poetry that was in those particular newspapers was that it was inherently in Xhosa. And so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to do both, or maybe something in between. And I'm kind of deciding then on what to do. So if I'm going to do a purely linguistic English one and then also a Xhosa one, or something in between to kind of also capture that, but also the sense of disconnection in terms of Port Elizabeth, because we do kind of have a particular interesting sense of spatial planning, which is indicative of like, or kind of basically echoes the rest of South Africa in and of itself. And I'm kind of looking at poetry in order to kind of draw on the effective as a means to kind of interrogate all of these things and kind of draw them into one particular kind of body of work that we can kind of engage with and kind of can create discussion, maybe further things from that, right? Basically, yeah, and that's effectively what I have on my end. Yeah, it's kind of like very much conceptual and a work in progress, but that's kind of like the overall framing of the offering that I had for the webinar today.
Okay, Simphiwe, thank you. Let me become visible again. Thanks so much. Yes, wonderful. I will open things up for questions and comments to anybody who wants to either put up your hand if you can, or send a message into the message thing, or otherwise draw attention to yourself in some way. And then we'll just, engage. So while you're kind of I don't know, bringing your thoughts together, there's something that I found really kind of interesting about what you're actually doing, and that's this idea of the cultural hybrid that you're kind of talking about now, because that seems to me maybe one of the motifs of future citizens of our city, that this hybridity is something, I don't know, it relates to complexity. It's what perked my mind up and thought up, and um, yeah, and I'm very interested that your actual work process mimics in a way the idea of hybridity. And I wondered if you had a little bit more to tell us about that.
Oh yes, yeah, that's something that I've been thinking about quite deeply as well, because as I said, we're kind of like in this interesting moment of kind of reflecting on the 200-year thing. Also, is kind of also understanding that to be closer in 2025 is also to be kind of mediated in that kind of way, and to also work through this kind of particular filter and kind of have both reference points as well. You've given me something to think about as well, in terms of kind of maybe kind of drawing that out of the work in terms of like thinking about it.
Oh,
But
um,
yeah, you are correct, because there's also like a sense of, even when I'm doing, yes, sorry, can you hear me?
yeah, sorry, you're breaking up a little bit. I'm not
Oh,
sure if that's on everybody's computer, but certainly on mine, I'm kind of like you came in and out of consciousness there a little bit. Sorry
okay.
about.
Okay. Am I back?
You're back, yes.
I'm back. Okay. So what I was talking about was also kind of, I think that hybridity thing also brings out kind of a particular idea when you kind of, when I'm discussing the historical and that interaction between things, of not kind of being essentialist, right? And kind of understanding that even working within these different modes, that there is kind of like an interesting give and take, and there's an interesting kind of critical appreciation for that acculturative process, but also
Mm,
understanding that while also I kind of grew up with a very oral kind of upbringing, there's also kind of like the literary stuff that happened. I'm also like an English literature major. So there's
yes.
kind of playing around with those particular kind of that juxtaposition, and those particular, yeah, and kind of like sitting in that place of compromise a little bit. And it is quite a productive space to sit in. Yeah.
Fabulous. Okay, thanks, Simphiwe. I see Emma has a hand up. Maybe we should wait. Hi, Emma.
Yeah.
Hello. Hey, Simphiwe, so awesome to listen to your talk. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm actually, it might sound surprising, but I'm quite familiar. I'm going to say his name wrong, with Mpho, because
Mhm.
when I had to teach at Rhodes University, I taught for like 12 years there, and I was always a contract lecturer, and I was asked to teach classical social theory.
Mm.
And I was like, oh my goodness, really? And it was around this time frame. And I looked at the prospectus, and it was all basically white European men. And I went on a sort of a woman hunt for different voices. And that's when I came across Samuel. And I I sort of looked a little bit into his history and into his past. And I actually chose to use his praise poetry as it originally was printed. And it was a struggle to find these praise poems actually in print. But I managed to find a few of them, and I got some of my students to actually read them out. And there was it was I'm telling you this because it was an incredibly powerful moment that I just hadn't reckoned on. I was just trying to diversify the curriculum, and I used Clay's praise poems as a reflection on how classical social theory doesn't have to be boxed into a particular type of epistemological hierarchy. We don't have to write everything down. Not everything has to be presented in a particular way for it to be deeply valid and important to the students. And they absolutely loved his work. And it took all of them a lot of time to translate the praise poems, because they said that the language had changed so much from, so my students delved into this, and they took it upon themselves to go and to translate as best they could, or the meanings of these praise poems, but to put it into their own context. And many of them chose Mpho as their theorist, if you like, their social commentator, to write essays about. So I ended up with all of these amazing translations. And one of my students wrote to me after the course and said that it had changed her experience reading these praise poems and looking into the depth of this man's wisdom and humanity, because he was very powerfully courageous, but he was also a strong advocate for reconciliation and for peace, essentially. But my students responded so deeply to reading these, because they said that they felt like they had some grasp of their history that they could actually relate to, and that their parents could relate to. So I've gone off on a bit of a tangent, but I'm just wondering, like your focus on hybridity, and I think that's beautiful, but like, I feel like there needs to be some hanging on to the past in order to reconstruct a different future. So what I'm trying to say is, do you think that there's a place for maintaining? I felt a bit sad that the language was being translated almost even by Xhosa people now today. So do you use any of the original words and phrases from the folklore in the way that they were used, or is there like how does your hybridity like work? I'm just interested in this, because with my students, I felt like it was something was missing when they sort of changed the words to fit how they could understand it, and I felt like something was being lost there through the prose poems. So I'm just wondering what you...
Oh yeah, that's a lovely question. Thank you, Emma. I think the tricky thing, firstly, the tricky thing with Xhosa sometimes, especially with the kind of Xhosa that Gqeberha uses, it's similar to like the Xhosa that's used in the kind of the first Bibles, right? Which is funny because a lot of Xhosa people, even though we don't necessarily, like modern Xhosa speech doesn't echo that, people prefer to buy that Bible when going to church. So they want that particular translation, that particular one. The tricky thing also with Xhosa is like the datedness, but also the regional varieties as well. Because it's not, even though like you go to school and learn a particular variety, there's kind of a lot of differences based on where you live, and also generational differences, and also basically also that kind of urban-rural split as well. So with Gqeberha will present as very complex and kind of dated. So to some people, or to a lot of people, if you're not generally kind of like a linguist or kind of a scholar in that kind of way, and kind of have to be retrained in understanding it in that way, it feels like kind of like a regular speaker encountering Shakespeare sometimes. So that kind of becomes the thing. But I do feel, and I think from my personal reference point, because I was raised by my great-grandmother, I do appreciate the depth of that particular language. So even when I do write, there's always a thing of kind of playing around with those particular forms. And a lot of the original language doesn't survive into now. One of the ways that it survives quite nicely is the use of proverbs and idioms, which, even though they're dated, they kind of come back into circulation, and they are an incredible way to keep that alive. Another form, actually, which is quite contemporary, which is quite interesting, is when you find like a lot of those kind of oral kind of characteristics or idiosyncrasies, is Xhosa commentary, Xhosa sports commentary, which is interesting because it keeps some of those interesting oral flourishes and stuff like that. I think I understand what you mean. I think if I could be a purist, I would be. But they are, so I try to play around as much as I can, but like there's also an aspect of due to kind of that whole kind of conversion process and all that kind of stuff, there's a lot of cultural loss, especially also with schooling in a particular way. And even if you kind of will go home and kind of speak Xhosa at home and all that kind of stuff, medium of instruction is still English. So there's still kind of a difference in one's kind of linguistic command between the two. But as much as we can, I think a lot of the time, the way we kind of keep in touch with those would be to like consult our elders and kind of see, you'd be like, I don't recognize this term, I've never heard it before. And then they may tell you what it's related to, etc., etc., etc. So it's kind of, I think community is one of the ways in which that can kind of keep going on.
Awesome. Thank you. Love it.
Okay, thanks so much, Simphiwe. One quick question. It's basically related to that, and it's something really interesting. I think that there's often, when you start talking about culture, you start talking about cultural loss, and this idea then of looking to the past to imagine the future, always seems to come into this discourse of there's something special about the past, that if we drop it, we are experiencing loss. And there's not a lot of talk in this kind of conversation about what can be created as a future of a future culture in a way.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of sympathetic to the idea that there's a lot of richness in the past that gets lost, but we never seem to really move that conversation past loss to what is being created. And I'm hoping that some of your work is doing that.
Oh, yes. Okay. I think I like that you've said that, actually, because it gives me a chance to speak to that. I think you are right that it hasn't been highlighted quite as much in this particular thing. And I think it's because the people that I'm focusing on are in the past in terms of that particular mode. But I think in terms of kind of in terms of like reimagining, there are interesting examples, Vili Collective, where they're kind of reimagining these different forms. They're using media in order to refashion it in a way that's almost kind of is very digital native, and in a way that acknowledges this difference, and also kind of does a thing where it kind of works in a sankofa kind of position, where it kind of looks to the past to look forward, but not in kind of too much of a mournful way that kind of looks at the past as this kind of pre-fall Edenic garden, but rather as a kind of place to look to in order to kind of maybe find inspiration in how to basically move forward. But I do think it's a kind of complex and multi-pronged conversation. And as I said, like earlier, it's kind of tricky because it's kind of like this kind of delicate dance of kind of like acknowledging particular things and seeing particular things and trying to kind of draw what you can from the past, but also understand that you can't have the past back. And so the idea then is to kind of see what essence of particular things can be refashioned, reimagined, and reframed.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you. I love the idea of that delicate dance. I can see you twinkle toeing across the moon. Gary.
Afternoon, Simphiwe. Sorry, my connection keeps dropping.
Gary's question. Okay. I see your question, or would you like to contextualize it?
No, I was just wondering, in terms of your journey and standing next to the Swartkops and your reflection on sort of early Xhosa poetry, whether there are contemporary poets, contemporary Xhosa people that are writing poetry that speaks to what you experienced on the side of the Swartkops, and how accessible that is, you know. So yeah. Sorry,
I think I lost you there for a sec. I think you were talking about, okay, effectively they are and I do understand what you're saying there. Yes, they are contemporary poets, and I own a lot of collections of them in that kind of instance. I think my kind of idea of going into the past was to kind of play around a little bit with a few things. So the idea was then to kind of maybe, because the kind of mode of poetry that I work in is kind of primarily print, sometimes will be oral. And that has to do with kind of like the English literature training and all of that kind of stuff. But so then this time I was kind of trying to explore an oral first kind of framework. And so idea then was to kind of look back at that particular moment and see then how those particular poets negotiated or split the difference between those particular two. And I think also the kind of mode that I wanted to write or that I am writing the elegy in, is kind of an older form as compared to more contemporary Xhosa poetry that I've been reading, which is kind of more, some of it is it's very, especially the ones that I've been reading recently, it's very urban, it's very atomic, it's very interesting, but also some of it leans towards more spoken word. And I don't know if that's necessarily what I'm doing at this particular moment. I think I'm kind of embodying something more traditional, but you are very correct there that like if I'm exploring something different, then those poets would be an interesting kind of new avenue to be in conversation with.
Thanks, Simphiwe. I think Gary is also moving in and out of consciousness. You are a little bit in and out, but I'm not sure how that will play out in the actual recording. So let's just, yeah, we'll carry on and see what happens. Could you chat to us a little bit more about the elegy? As far as I understand, I'm not very good at the literature thing. As far as I understand, it is loss and grief, but maybe some kind of consolation or hope at the end.
Yes. So so it works. Yeah, so I'm kind of working within that mode, and it's kind of working more in kind of this, like as you said, it's kind of more in a bittersweet kind of sense. But it is imagining the idea of, I think that the idea that I'm playing with there is kind of perhaps there may be kind of like flowing and running and things of that sort. So I have kind of like an idea for like a more positive, or not a positive, but maybe a hopeful note, because I do appreciate stories that kind of work in that kind of way. So it's not entirely very completely dystopian, but it also is kind of, since it draws from something that did actually happen in Zambia, it's almost also like a cautionary tale, as a lot of kind of the stories that I've kind of been dealing with lately, because they kind of work as like, those oral stories work as kind of things, kind of like these fantastical exemplars of things that could happen or that shouldn't happen. And so I'm kind of working within that particular mode, is kind of using it in that particular form as well.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Yes, also given the fact that we have a kind of a sewage plant right next to that estuary.
Yes.
Yeah, which is kind of scary. Yeah.
Yes.
As far as the future goes, anyway.
Yes.
Emma, I see your hand.
Yeah, jumping in again.
Thank you.
I did try and post something into the box, but my computer's doing all sorts of, I think the reception is just awful today. I don't know what's going on. So Simphiwe, when it comes to your poetry, are you going to be performing any of your work publicly?
I don't I don't know yet. I was trying not to perform. That's why I was like, oh, this will be recorded. But I mean, my arm can be twisted. Yeah,
I'd love to see it.
Yeah, sure. My arm can be twisted in that sense. I could perform it instead of doing like this kind of petrified recording thing. So sure. I guess I could perform. I'll have to work on the kind of nerves. It's funny because I lecture regularly, but like performing poetry feels like something else entirely. But yeah, I guess I'm amongst friends.
Cool.
So,
yeah, I get that. I get that whole, there's a big difference between talking to people and sharing knowledge and then performing a part of your soul, if you like, exposing yourself. Very different. Anyway, I'll shut up. I see there are other hands up now as well.
okay, thanks. So we're not letting you off the hook, Simphiwe. I would love to hear if you are promising potentially something now, but I'd love to hear from Glenn first, and then we'll give you time to catch your breath and maybe just decide whether you would like to. Okay, Glenn.
Thanks, Andrea. And I'm not sure why you're speaking with your camera off, Andrea, but nevertheless.
Oh, sorry, it's just to do with the
network.
The reception seems so bad. I thought maybe the video would help.
Would help, yes. Well, I hope I'm audible. But thank you so much, Simphiwe, for a beautiful talk. I do want to encourage you to consider doing the performance of your poetry also, because I want to follow up on this question that Emma posed to you, which is to say, Do you think there's something that happens in the recitation of the poetry as performativity? I was struck by that part of your presentation also. There were two parts of your talk that really struck me. The first was the biographical, because I'm so invested in always who's the person behind this, birthing this creative work. And it was wonderful to hear you unpack that about the poet that you'd studied, but also I want to get into that with yourself now also. So do you think there's something that happens with the performativity of a poetry, whereby I'm thinking of this idea which I often use in music, and I say to my students, "Are you having an identity in music, or is music in your identity?" And so I wanted to pose that question to you also to say, are you having an identity in poetry, or is poetry in your identity? And does that influence how people relate to the performativity of the poetry? Because I've known some poets who sort of gravitate towards either side of this binary. And you spoke about binaries also in your presentation. So the one is the poet which seems to say, my poetry is a literary art. It's the words on the paper with the sense making being done, or the shock factor, the rattling, the effect of it on the psyche of the human. And you said that you also, having studied English literature, Xhosa literature, and being a scholar yourself, you're familiar that the written word has immense power, and you alluded to that in your talk. But as a performance theorist, I'm interested in what happens when it's uttered out, when it's embodied, when there's some sort of agency behind animating it. And are we going to get a taste of that with you when you perform it? Is there something that happens where you maybe shift out of maybe just having an identity in poetry to having poetry in your identity, and vice versa? But I'm going to leave it there and hand it over to you. But I hope the connection will sustain a good conversation. So I'm going to switch off my camera and audio now.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, Glenn. That's an interesting question. I think you asked if I have, yes, sorry, Prof?
No, sorry, nothing from
Prof,
me.
first, were you saying something?
No, you go ahead.
Okay, cool. Okay. I guess you asked if I have an identity in poetry, or poetry has an identity in me. I think the latter. I think I do understand poetry as kind of like this literary device, and this very kind of externalized thing that you can sense make and interact with as an intellectual activity. But I do think my interaction with poetry is always in a kind of way where it feels like something innate. It's kind of the thing that I've been like probably doing the longest, at least the writing of it. I think later in my life, it kind of came to a particular point where I was like, okay, I guess I must perform these things. Not must, but I guess must. I kind of feel kind of more pushed or called to kind of say the words and kind of figure out what they feel like when they are voiced, embodied in those particular things. And I think also that's kind of a particular thing where I think initially when I started writing poetry, it was very much kind of inspired by the poets that I was kind of encountering. So it would be, you know, your Shakespeare's, your Langston Hughes, and those types of people. And it would be very much poets that I would encounter either from like a very literary kind of sense through a classroom, and then kind of go on a kind of like enter into a rabbit hole. But now I find that when I do write poetry, what I'm trying to kind of get at is also to try kind of embody a particular thing I grew up with a lot of times improvise. Is that kind of embodied thing where the meaning making is also beyond just the word, and it also kind of activates the entire self, the body, and those types of things. So I think that happens, and I think I see it happen more when because then I find that in confluence that starts to happen, because Xhosa is very sonically interesting, and so even when you say it, there's often a joke amongst Xhosa people. They kind of talk about the idea that akekho umXhosa omathi leyo, which is kind of this idea of like there's no meek Xhosa person, which is the kind of thing that you kind of like, it's almost programmed into you that when you do speak Xhosa, you have to land it, because it's not just in the word, it's in the embodiment. And so I'm starting to find that the more I kind of like write in between or write in Xhosa and write in Xhosa with English, then it starts to kind of shake up that kind of hyper intellectual petrified thing that I kind of would do with poetry in English, due to kind of the whole English literature thing. But yeah, I'm finding that kind of there's more kind of sonic possibilities that I follow now, rather than just mental or linguistic ones. So I think also performance kind of offers then an opportunity to then kind of see how that feels. Because I think one of the things that I'm still kind of trying to figure out in kind of piecing together this poem, because I challenged myself to kind of have an almost sonic first approach, to kind of almost, or even when I'm writing, try record the lines first rather than write them down, which is normally what I do, or to kind of do something that kind of leans more towards the sonic. It's been an interesting process, because I'm kind of finding myself somewhere in between. And that's why I was kind of leaning more towards the recording, but then I kind of also landed with the idea of also having the tactile pieces there as well. So I think the challenge that has been posed to kind of be like, oh, could you perform? Embody that other part. I hope this kind of answered the question, even though it's a very roundabout way.
Thanks, Simphiwe. Yes, we are having sound issues, and so sorry about that. I would love to, if possible, maybe for the last 5 minutes of the seminar, maybe twist your arm. Or would that be possible? With the risk that the sound would be horrible, in which case we'll accept that and then maybe try to twist your arm for another performance at some point. But should we try? Should we risk it?
I can. So this one's not finished, but I can. Do you want to hear this one? I can read you another one.
Your choice. Love to just hear something vocal for our last 5 minutes. Yeah.
Yay.
Oh dear, but we've lost Simphiwe. Let's see if he'll come back.
Okay, let me pull something up. Let me find the one in particular. Okay. Okay. This one's not too long, but it's one that it hasn't actually been published. It's kind of been sitting here. It's mostly, I'll read you, and it's written in English, but it has some Xhosa elements to it. I hope everyone can hear me.
Yes, at the moment, yes.
Okay. Rhythms in Blue. Remembering is wading into a seething, heaving river that will not still. Ukukhumbula kukuwela inciba. Walking into the mouth of that bellowing thing, foaming at the mouth and praying that it has been fed. Remembering is to dismember. Sorry. Yes. Remembering is to dismember time into exact sequences, into, sorry, I'm trying to see properly here. Okay, there we go. Into singular images, still life renderings that refuse to sit still long enough to be seized. A trail of smoke, kwikhandlela elimhlophe. The fading, sweet-smelling adieu of Imbebo. faint hiss of prayers at the witching hour, the white flash of your endless array of beads, a hint of blue in some of them, the ebbing rhythms of childhood, the scorching sun running, feeling the earth beneath, between my fingers, pain at the back of my knees from walking, running, the languid laziness of uqaqaqa growing, bitter scent of whitewash, odor of standing water stagnating, cat entrails splayed on a township road, the sight of an owl atop our roof. Yeah, so that's that one.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yes. And then I'll find you the other one. And this is the one of the ones that was, yeah, this is one of the ones that was longlisted, actually. So it's called Him in the Year After. It was kind of written in like honor of my great grandmother, a little bit, kind of, yeah. So it's called Him in the Hereafter. After you, after everything, I brandished out with the certainty of a crucifix. I hum misgivings in three-part harmony, wail like an organ, fill the ribs of the cathedral within my chest with a thundering beat, rhythm unrelenting, flat palm on the underside of a Bible. Hour after you of a sundown, like the hallowed breath of a priest blowing out. Yeah. So those, yeah, that's what I've got for you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Simphiwe. That was, yay, you can see all the claps coming up the screen. Yeah, we lost you in and out a little bit with the sound, but you never know. That might be some kind of weird emergence
Yes.
that changes your poem into something strange and interesting. You never know. But thank you so much for that. That was a wonderful way to start the weekend, and such an interesting hybridity, wasn't it? Your very kind of English accent, not British English, but Cape Town English, I think, together with you know, a whole cultural background that you have. I mean, you are a completely hybrid person. And yeah, that was so interesting and exciting to listen to you. So we're going to do this again. I'm hoping that our recording will be better than the kind of you never know, the slight in and out of sound that we had. But thank you so much for persisting, and yeah, everybody's excited and clapping. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, guys.
Yeah.